What has been the impact of student encampments on university campuses in America? And what has changed as a result of these protests? This is what we're going to look at in this episode of the Colony Archive. In 2024, we saw major dissent on university campuses all over the United States. This dissent included protests and encampments against the U.S.'s unconditional support for Israel. And they reminded us of the protests of the civil rights and the anti-war movements of the 1960s. These campus protests were unprecedented. I remember in 2010s, if there was a student protest in response to Israel's violence against the Palestinians, most of the people who attended were Arabs and Muslims. But now the protests cut across demographics. Students from diverse racial, national, and religious backgrounds, and significantly from the Jewish community, have joined the campus protests.
Here to say that Israel and their crimes against the Palestinian people do not reflect us as Jews, and that Jeremy Hefner and company may no longer use us as political pawns to continue ignoring the demands and interests of your student body. Our demands include disclosure, divestment, declaration, defense, and decolonization.
The protests also cut across political belief and include elements from the left joined by the liberals, but also by the more anti-establishment conservatives who have lended their support. This is a range of opposition from humanitarian to fiscal grounds. Some don't want massive amount of their national revenue being sent to a foreign country without receiving a tangible return on their investment. Many others oppose Israel's war on Palestine because they view it as a genocidal act and also as an act of ethnic cleansing.
Who has done to the Palestinians since October 7th is a Holocaust. It is a Holocaust that is being committed on Palestinian children and women. And I'm not going to quiet my perspective on that, to kowtow to whatever the prevailing narrative is at the New York Post.
The protest began from Columbia University, my own alma mater, in April of 2024. Soon they spread to college campuses across the United States. And then came a crackdown from university administrations and the police. A combination of university-imposed disciplinary punishment on the students, crackdown by administrations and police forces, and the summer break ended the encampments. However, the encampments have had important consequences. For one, they expose that there's a major clash between official state policy and public opinion on the question of Palestine. For the longest time, what the US government did, for the most part, matched with the broader ideological climate of the country. American theorists Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman had discovered an unsettling quality about the flow of information in their country, which they refer to as the manufacturing of consent, published into a book by the same title in the year 1988.
Well, I would suggest that Jane take a close look at the way the media operate, the way the public relations industry operates, the extensive thinking that's been going on for a long period about the necessity for finding ways to marginalize and control the public in democratic society. But particularly to look at the evidence that's been accumulated about the way the major media, the sort of agenda-setting media, the national press and the television and so on, the way that they shape and control the kinds of opinions that appear, the kinds of information that comes through, the sources to which they go, and so on. And I think that Jane will find some very surprising things about the democratic system.
They came up with this idea before the age of the internet. And they meant that the most accessed media, which at the time were the major broadcast TV and radio channels and the mainstream papers, set parameters on what was permissible discourse. So when it came to the question of economic equality or American wars abroad, you could have a debate, but within very narrow parameters which wouldn't threaten such things as the power of the owning class or the US-led imperialist order. For example, when it came to the 2003 Iraq War, you could perhaps criticize the specific war strategies pursued by the Bush administration, but you couldn't have a proper debate on whether the US had any moral standing to invade Iraq in the first place. And any conceptual reference to the idea of imperialism was pretty much out of the question. Americans like to view themselves as the world's moralistic policemen. instead of an imperialist agent of exploitation and instability.
There was a virtual blackout of any dissent on any mass media in this country. A virtual blackout. There was literally a handful of people who were allowed to go on television and speak out against this war. There's I think a fairly broad awareness that Phil Donahue was allowing dissent as to our Russia and the war on his program that was on MSNBC at the time. Remember, MSNBC at that time was not in any shape or form a liberal network. Phil Donahue was the edge of that spectrum, and he was his show was taken off the air in the run-up to the war, ostensibly because he was too expensive relative to the ratings. His ratings were that he was the top-rated show on the network. A memo surfaced later saying that NBC was concerned that he was bringing on too many anti-war people and that it was not a good marketing position for NBC to be in the run-up to this war.
So we have Bill Keller, New York Times, Tom Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, George Packer, New Yorker writer, Zakaria, Newsweek reporter, Jeffrey Goldberg, The Atlantic, Peter Bienert, Hitchens, Paul Berman, a whole host of what I would have to call almost neoliberal liberals going for this war, going for it either because they thought we were in a war of civilizations or because they accepted there were weapons of mass destruction, etc. I asked myself at the time, how can these people believe this stuff? Of a belief in who this country, they really believe that this country is exceptional, has to rule the world, and they buy into that fact. And therefore, they're willing to really suspend their judgment and their reason and go for a war that was just completely fictitious.
Another more recent example of the narrow parameters of the political discourse was when veteran journalist Abby Martin attended the 2021 UN Climate Conference to ask a legitimate question from U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Abby Martin with the Empire Files. Speaker Pelosi, you just presided over a large increase in the Pentagon budget. This Pentagon budget is already massive. The Pentagon is a larger polluter than 140 countries combined. How can we seriously talk about net zero if there is this bipartisan consensus to constantly expand this large contributor to climate change, which is exempt from these conferences? Military is exempt from climate talks.
Since Pelosi was so accustomed to the narrow discourse of the mainstream media and the softballs she would receive from them, she was completely unprepared to respond.
National security advisors all tell us that the climate crisis is a national security matter. It is, of course, a health matter for our children, the water they drink, the air they breathe, etc. It is a jobs issue between clean technologies being the future of our workforce and the training for all of that. It is a national security issue because of the all of the conditions that climate crisis produces. I won't go into all of them, but they do are cause for migration, conflict over habitat and resources, and again, a security challenge.
As you see, she offered a rambling, irrelevant response about national security, disregarding Abby Martin's question. In a way, you could say that the question wasn't even comprehensible to her. The mainstream media, a major producer of culture and ideology, has manufactured the consent of the American population so that they do not sympathize with the obvious injustices committed with their tax dollars against the Palestinians. But it hasn't just been the media. You have the same problem in other places, such as schools, universities, churches, and even NGOs. I remember from my own experience attending high school in the United States. In my political science class, if you mention anything about the historically documented dispossession of the Palestinians or the violations of international law by Israel, it was as if you were speaking gibberish. October 7th broke down the old harmony between a state position and public opinion. A Gallup poll in March of 2024 showed that the majority of Americans now disapprove of Israel's operations in Gaza. Even though the state of the economy probably had more to do with Harris's defeat to Trump, her nearly unconditional armed support to Israel made her unpopular among many voters, especially younger voters and the college-attending demographics who were participants in the encampments. So why did the harmony between the government and public opinion break down all of a sudden? Well, it didn't happen overnight. For a few decades now, there has been a relatively free flow of information about Western colonialism. And lots of research has been done on what Western empires did to the world they colonized, with their immoral implications being quite evident to those who have read the research. The research has especially increased since the emergence of post-colonialism as a major field of study. Post-colonialism looks at and critiques Western knowledge production and the political domination of the non-West. Post-colonial scholars reveal to us how Western discourses dehumanize people in the colonies. They also expose the political and economic practices that dispossess people in the non-West, including Palestine, of their land and resources.
We destroyed the economy. We deported most of the capable people. We forced the people to live in hovels and refugee camps over a period. I mean, if anybody's been to Gaza, it's one of the most criminal places on earth because of Israeli policy of occupation.
We have covered on this program the three interrelated concepts of imperialism, colonialism, and settler colonialism. In the same episode, we show how there is a close relationship between Western imperialism and the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Students at U.S. colleges also saw this rather evident relationship, so they read the important studies about Western colonialism, and then through the internet and alternative media, they had access to the reality of life for the Palestinians under Israeli occupation. And it was just too obvious that what Israel does to the Palestinians is just too similar to what many of the white settlers did to the people in the colonies. It was history repeating itself, and their conscience moved them against the Israeli genocide that commenced in 2023.
I have no idea if that's just a scare tactic or if it's real, but it doesn't matter because the difference between us and people like these cops is that there are limits to when we continue following orders. And when you're talking about a genocide visited upon a colonized population of 2 million people trapped in a ghetto that's as long as a marathon and 6 miles wide, when that ghetto is being systematically starved, slaughtered, every hospital bombed, every university bombed, 70% of homes destroyed, 40,000 people murdered, 15,000 children murdered, the entire population on the brink of starvation, we say, and if our government and our academic institutions are complicit in this, there comes a point where we say we're not following orders and it doesn't matter what you do to us because there are principles and there are human lives that matter more than our careers and our futures. But this is what this university has never understood, has never accepted, has never reckoned with about this student movement, and not just at UChicago but around the country, is that the commitment to Gaza runs deeper than fears for our safety, fears for our careers, fears for our paychecks. It is a fundamental obligation we have as citizens of a country that is presiding over this genocide, arming this genocide, and as students at a university that is invested in those same weapons manufacturers and that is partnered with the same apartheid institutions that train that military and develop its technology.
Now, whenever discord breaks between government position and public opinion, the state begins to either apply repression or try to change public opinion through softer means. In the case of the student protests, the state did apply repression, with police coming to campuses and removing the encampments. University administrations also investigated, suspended, or terminated professors who spoke in the support of Palestine.
I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you right now?
Yes, can you call the philosophy department office and tell them I've been requesting?
Fill up philosophy department?
Yes, call the philosophy department office.
I will. What's your...
I'm chair of the philosophy department.
I got you. I got you.
And Congress applied repression against those university administrators who were just not hardline enough against the encampments. Harvard president Claudine Gay had to step down simply because she supported a student right to free speech.
I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
And the use of repression cuts across the branches of government. Recently, the resurrected US President Donald Trump threatened to either deport or deny entry to student visa holders who support Palestine. After repression, or at the same time, the government and those who hold the funds and support his position also try to change public opinion. This year, we saw a number of research funds or positions on Israeli studies, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. But there was barely anything for Palestine. If you want to do research about these subjects, US universities would happily fund your research. But if you want to study Palestine, especially in the context of Israel's dispossession of the Palestinians, there are no subject-specific funds for you. As the concept of settler colonialism becomes linked to Israeli practices in the Palestinian territories, soon we might also see less and less funds being made available for the study of settler colonialism. So as with the mainstream media, those who provide money for research want to shift the discourse away from the live genocide in Gaza towards the victimization of Jews. This is also a very important issue, especially with all the right-wing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories flooding the internet in recent years. But you should ask, when there's a live genocide against the Palestinians, should it really be saying that all lives matter? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, pursued at many universities with the stated objective of greater inclusivity of identities and perspectives, is a noble goal. But then it just doesn't seem to apply to Palestine. Scholars of a Palestinian origin may be included as tokens for DEI initiatives, but when you follow the money, you see that they try to exclude Palestine from the research agenda. And Palestine only comes to the forefront of the debate because of the courage of the student encampments and dissenting professors. The government and those who fund research are doing their best to marginalize the opposition in support of Palestine. But the information on the occupation, ethnic cleansing, and genocide against the Palestinians is out there. And the US's population opposition to Israel has just begun to take promising directions. On the question of Palestine, the clash between the US government and the opinion of young Americans will likely continue to hold into future years. And we have to wait and see. But this clash, if not repressed effectively, might make a notable impact on the global order.